Well, let's turn to the inflation data this week. It has been a shock for mortgage holders as well as the Albanese government. Underlying inflation, this is the RBA's preferred measure, has risen to 3.5% for the month of October. Now, let's bring in to discuss this Judo Bank chief economist, Warren Hogan. Warren, great to see you again. Look, your reading of these CPI figures, it seems like the cost of living crisis is far from over. What do you think?
Yeah, hi, Sherry. Thanks for having me on the show. Exactly right. The headline numbers are obviously heavily distorted by these government subsidies, particularly the energy subsidy. And while that is obviously assistance with cost of living, it's a very different thing to inflation. And that's a process in the economy that puts pressure on all prices. And of course, these figures highlight that while headline inflation was only up 2.1, core inflation or underlying inflation is probably more like 3.5 or even a bit higher, because that number is also slightly affected by these subsidies. So it's not a disaster. It highlights that inflation is gradually coming down in this country, pretty much in line with what the RBA is forecasting. But that doesn't give us any wiggle room for rate cuts anytime soon.
And that's before we've seen, the pre-election spending that the Albanese government is likely to do. If they do hand out pre-election sweeteners, and we know Albanese is going to be inclined to do this to try and win over voters who are deserting him, and the polls show that they are, how much pressure would this put on inflation?
Well, I think it's a real problem for the economy, because we're going to see evidence next week of GDP growth picking up. And we're seeing this in a range of indicators that the economy sort of isn't sort of dead and buried as some people would like to think. It's actually on an improve. We're generating jobs and we're seeing the first green shoots of a recovery in consumer spending. And that will probably take us into next year. And if we get a lot of government spending on top of that, and this all happens before inflation is under control, well, the worst case is, of course, inflation picks up again and we have to see rate rises, and that would really risk a recession. So this is a critical period for the economy, and the last thing it's going to need is more government stimulus in the form of short-term handouts.
We've also seen suggestions this week that our living standards are worse than during the past 4 recessions. How do you think families are feeling this in terms of household disposable income?
Yeah, well, it's quite clear in the data that the standard of living impact of this post-COVID adjustment is much more severe here than in most countries. And of course, this is essentially people being able to get less with their income, and they're feeling it. Everyone's feeling it around discretionary and the little luxuries of life. But then now it's to a point where it's really hurting some households with essentials. And we're seeing this, I think, showing up in a range of social measures around people needing the food bank, needing support, and of course banks having to provide special consideration. So it's because this is dragging on. It's because it's been going on for so long, and it's because we're unwilling to address the problem head on, not raise rates enough, or governments not spend, and that's elongating this and dragging it all out.
I mean, you just said then, that it's more severe than in most other countries. We have seen some comparisons to other OECD nations where Australia isn't faring as well in the inflation fight and as well in the household disposable income. I mean, just how much worse off are we?
Yeah, I mean, look, there's a range of context on this, and it needs to be in the context that where we got to over the last 30 years was one of the wealthiest nations on earth. And then the spendathon that was the sort of immediate aftermath of the pandemic also needs to be considered. But the reality is that the backward step we've taken is somewhere around 8 to 10%, whereas most countries it's more like 5. Now, we've also done better in employment than most countries. So more people have got jobs, but as part of that process, we haven't raised interest rates and therefore allowed this inflation to hit everyone. So we're sort of, everyone's paying the price to ensure that employment continues to grow is one way to look at it. But of course, everyone is paying that price. And of course, it also means other things like higher interest rates for longer. And of course, the other one, which people don't talk about enough, is bracket creep and a higher income tax burden, which I think is really hurting people out there. And I don't think it's right that it's a hidden form of a tax increase that people don't fully understand.
No, 100%. And, you know, I never understand why our tax system isn't linked, the tax rates aren't linked to CPI like they are in many other parts of the world. I mean, this should be adjusted, shouldn't it?
Yeah, well, about half the world's advanced economies have this indexation. And I think that the mythology in this country is, well, the Labor Party likes to spend it and the Liberal Party likes to give you a tax cut every sort of 5 to 10 years and make you feel like they're doing something for you. But there is an economic reality to this that we're seeing in this inflation episode, which, of course, in the last 30 years of low inflation wasn't as critical because it wasn't as obvious. But we are in a more inflationary world, and I think this has to be addressed because the size of government in this country is getting to new record levels, and I'm very concerned about that.
It would be a good election announcement for Peter Dutton and a good election promise for him to say that he will address this issue, because you're right, bracket creep eats up the wage growth that we have seen under Labor. All right, Warren Hogan, thank you very much for your time.